Hello, my name is Allison Carpenter. Today I've prepared a video for you all to summarize my research topic, U.S. and Cuban Relations, a dashed stream of a hemisphere of nations. Since the very late 1700s, Cuba has been an area of allure to various political leaders of the United States. The close proximity of the two countries, just a mere 90 miles apart from coast to coast, has bound Cuba and the United States for better or for worse. Today, Cuba and the United States are known for their highly contentious relationship of blame-seeking and finger-pointing. Upon close examination of U.S.-Cuban relations from the 19th century until present day, it can be seen that their relationship has passed through three phases: a mutually beneficial trade-based relationship, a peculiar bond in which the United States assumed a role far greater than it could fulfill, and finally an association characterized by contempt and resentment. In this paper, I will argue that neither the United States nor Cuba is to blame for their soured relationship, but instead that global events demanded that each act in certain ways to preserve the well-being of their own country, which more often than not resulted in them having to betray the other. Many of America's first politicians marveled at the thought of annexing Cuba as a mere extension of the United States. Jefferson, in a letter to President Monroe, acknowledged, "I have ever looked on to Cuba as the most interesting addition, yet as I am sensible that this could never be obtained. Hence its independence is the best possible option for the United States to pursue." Shortly later, President Monroe produced the Monroe Doctrine, in which the United States explicitly stated that any interference in their hemisphere would be considered a threat to American peace. If they couldn't have Cuba, no one else would either. Cuba during the 19th century was the main sugar producer in the world, and the United States was a large buyer. As Spanish control permeated every facet of Cuban politics, social life, and economy, the United States grew, increasingly worried that their economic interests were in jeopardy. Cuban nationalists and the Spanish became engulfed in a battle for Cuban independence. While the United States preferred to remain uninvolved in the conflict, in an effort to preserve their relationship as one purely based on trade, the American economy was suffering serious repercussions and had no other alternative but to intervene. In 1899, President McKinley reiterated to the Senate and the House of Representatives that this nation has assumed before the world a grave responsibility for the future good government of Cuba. The destinies of Cuba are irrevocably linked with our own. We must see to it that free Cuba be a reality. In 1901, the U.S. issued the Platt Amendment, which expressed that the United States would be able to intrude upon Cuban affairs if it was in their own best interests. Cubans reacted to the amendment with disdain and anger, but their impotence as a country left them with no other alternative than to comply. The United States' earnest desire to hold Cuba upright as a nation that would be fit to trade with, in an attempt to promote a hemisphere of trade, prosperity, and security, caused them to overstep the original boundaries their founders set in place. Instead, they instilled a relationship that evolved around favors and unprecedented standards. American businessmen poured investments into the island. The investments drastically improved infrastructure, created a surplus of jobs, and increased the amount of exports. As more militaristic, diplomatic, and political attention was demanded on a global scale, the U.S. had less time and means to deal with Cuba and left the region largely neglected. Amidst the demands and distractions resulting from the aftermath of World War I, Gerardo Machado rose to power in Cuba. His unwillingness to cooperate with other leaders led him to become dictator-like towards the end of his time in office. After taking away many of the rights that were promised to individuals in their constitution, Cubans appealed to the U.S. for help under the explicitly stated provisions of the Platt Amendment. The U.S. hesitation to help Cubans in their time of need created feelings of animosity and resentment, seeing that Cuba had pledged their allegiance and support to America during World War I. The United States responded by annulling the Platt Amendment and replacing it with the Good Neighbor Policy of 1933. The Good Neighbor Policy explained that the United States would assume a position that did not require them to mediate Latin American matters and would more closely resemble the association the two regions once had, one based on trade and trade only. In the midst of the post-World War II shuffle, Fulgencio Batista was in his second term as ruler of Cuba. Batista's second term was orchestrated in a dictator-like fashion and was saturated with many offenses against human rights. The U.S. main concern was arming the hemisphere against communism under the Mutual Security Act of 1951. The U.S. supported Batista, who had vowed to remain loyal to American interests, a move that received much backlash from Cuban citizens. The ill sentiments felt towards the United States hit an unprecedented high when U.S. policymakers limited the amount of Cuban sugar that could be bought by Americans. The masses of Cuba, most of which were poverty-ridden from Batista's reign, inherited a particular distaste for the United States. Following World War II, two superpowers arose, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union maintained a political and social ideology that stood in direct defense to America's, and it became increasingly obvious the two opposing ideologies could not coexist. America expected the hemisphere to act in a great collective effort against communism. The Soviets had agreed to buy Cuban sugar to replace the massive economic deficit that was produced by the U.S. absence. The influx of economic support provided by the Soviet Union was felt in all individuals across all social strata and evoked feelings of trust and fidelity to the Soviet Union. Castro implemented the agrarian reforms of 1959. Under the reforms, Castro nationalized American-owned businesses and privately held property without any just financial compensation. The United States, appalled by the actions of their southern counterpart, retaliated with an embargo that would destroy the Cuban economy even further. What each country perceived as a direct threat against their own state was merely the other acting in a manner of self-preservation. Even after the Cold War dispute was settled through a series of diplomatic compromises, the tensions between the United States and Cuba still remain passionate and heavy. It started out as a mutually beneficial relationship based on trade in the early 19th century, evolved into one of haste, blame assigning, and contempt. It is the United States' fault for first making themselves available to perform a number of duties that they did not have the capacity to fulfill, and it was Cuba's mistake for attaching themselves to the other end of the umbilical cord.